Once upon a time, in one of the beautiful and charming houses of our story's city, there lived a kind girl named Julia with her father and mother. Julia was a sweet and funny girl with messy orange hair. Her skin was as white as rice, and freckles were visible all over her rosy cheeks. Sometimes, when the sky turned cloudy and it started to rain, Julia would sit in front of the mirror and stare at her reflection. As she connected the freckles on her face with a red marker like stars, she thought about the moon, stars, planets, and galaxies that she wished to visit one day and see closely. One autumn day, Julia went to the park with her grandmother to take a walk and feed the pigeons. Julia's grandmother really loved the pigeons and thought it was her duty to feed them. It seemed that the pigeons also liked her and were happy to see her. However, Julia did not like them, and it didn't seem that they liked her either. Every time Julia threw a piece of bread for them, they would flap their wings and fly away. When Grandma gave Julia another piece of bread to throw to the pigeons, she decided to eat the bread herself. However, her grandmother shook her head in disapproval and the pigeons flew away before the bread could hit the ground. At that moment, Julia's attention was drawn to the shaking of the black feathers. It was a large bird with black feathers and a sharp beak, and it picked up the piece of bread that Julia had thrown on the ground and ate it. Julia began to laugh happily and threw another piece of bread. The crow immediately picked it up from the ground and ate it. But at that moment, Julia's grandmother ran after the crow, and the poor crow had to be quickly fly away and sit on a branch of the tree. When Julia and her grandmother were on their way off home, her grandmother explained to her, "We don't feed the crows. They don't deserve to eat bread. Crows are bad birds. They are mean, wicked, and cunning." However, Julia didn't think that. She had a different opinion. Julia loved the crows and thought they were very beautiful and lovely. It seems that the crow liked Julia too. The next morning, the black crow of our story was sitting on the favorite bench of Julia and her grandmother, waiting for them to arrive. And Julia and her grandmother entered the park and saw the crow. Julia's grandmother chased the crow with her back and scared it away. But the crow didn't fly. It just hopped off the bench and started moving back and forth on the ground, with curiosity looking at Julia and her grandmother. Grandmother chased the crow again and then scattered a handful of bread on the ground for the pigeons. The poor crow flew up to a branch of a tree and looked down at Julia and her grandmother. From there, Julia, feeling sad and upset, looked at the crow and thought to herself how unfair and unjust this was. When the sun reached the middle of the sky, Julia and her grandmother got ready to head back home. The crow, realizing they were leaving, followed them, hopping from branch to branch. It flew from a tree branch towards the red traffic lights and then landed on the ground, moving back and forth. In short, it was flying behind Julia and her grandmother, going wherever they went. Julia was surprised and amazed. She thought to herself, this is just an ordinary crow and it's very beautiful. It doesn't seem to be mean or cunning at all. When Julia and her grandmother reached home, Julia waved goodbye to her crow friend and said farewell. The next morning, Julia woke up early and after having breakfast, she got ready to go to the park. She had filled all the pockets of her clothes with breadcrumbs and wanted to scatter them for her crow friend. But when Julia arrived at the park, there was no sign of the crow. No matter where she looked, she couldn't find the crow. It wasn't on the bench, it wasn't on the branches of the trees, and it wasn't in the sky or under the bushes either. Julia returned home with sadness and disappointment. Her father, mother, and grandmother were both worried and surprised to see the upset and gloomy Julia's face, wondering what had happened to their happy and cheerful girl. Julia went straight to her room and sat on the edge of her bed, feeling choked up. She felt very lonely and said, why didn't anyone want to be friends with her? Why didn't the pigeons like her? Why had the black crow suddenly disappeared? As Julia was feeling sad, suddenly she heard a sound from the window. Who was it that was looking at Julia with his shiny black eyes? Yes, it was the crow. The crow was pecking quickly at the window of Julia's room with his beak. Julia quickly brought a chair from her room, placed it under the window, climbed up, and then opened the window. Julia excitedly said, I thought you had left me. She was very happy that her friend had returned and started laughing and celebrating. Julia scattered all the crumbs of bread she had prepared for Crew on the window, and the crew immediately began pecking and eating happily. Julia, with courage and kindness, gently started to pet the crew. When the crow finished eating and had consumed all the crumbs, it didn't fly away. Instead, it stayed there to listen to Julia's stories and tales. It performed funny dances and movements to entertain the Julia. How wonderful it was that Julia had finally found a friend, and she was very happy and satisfied with this.